Today I'm gonna show the theory in the most common Ruy Lopez sidelines. So the Ruy Lopez starts after the moves 1 e4, e5, controlling the center, and after knight to f3, black needs to defend the e5 pawn, and he plays the move knight to c6, of course defending the e5 pawn as well as developing, and after bishop to b5, the most logical continuation. Now of course black has a lot of different moves he can choose. a6 is the main line, d6 the Stein's defense, or knight to f6, known as the Berlin defense. But of course, black can choose to play some sidelines. Today we will take a look at the move knight g to e7, known as the Cozio defense. We will look at the move pawn to g6, and we'll look at the most problematic for most players to play, which is to play the move knight to d4 on the third move of the game. This is known as the bird's defense. And of course, the Cozio defense with knight g to e7 is the most popular of them all. This is very known sideline, and it is very good for black pieces, and many of your opponents won't know how to respond. Then there is this move pawn to g6. This is known as the Smyslov defense or the Fianchetto defense. Of course, you will play the move bishop g7, and you will maybe even play the move pawn to f5, striking at the center, and you will have great position. And then there is this knight to d4 move, and of course you have to take the knight if you are white, and then you will play c6 and d5 with the black pieces, and many of your opponents won't know what to do. They won't know how to deal with the position, and therefore the sideline is good. So of course, after bishop to b5 from white, today we'll look at three different options, starting with the move knight to d4, the bird's defense, which is the most problematic to many players, and it is played the least on the top level. So after knight to d4, you have to play the move knight takes d4. Of course, you cannot take the pawn on e5 because your bishop on b5 is simply hanging, so you simply take the knight, and after the trade occurs, you simply castles. You will play the move pawn to d3 and f4 if allowed, and after castles, now black has two options. He can either play bishop to c5, the sideline, or you can play the main move, which is to play pawn to c6. So after bishop to c5, the best move in the position is to play d3, trying to develop your bishop. You will play knight to d2 in the future, or maybe even c3 and then taking back with the knight is fine. Of course, with this move d3, you are preparing the move pawn to f4, taking away some crucial squares in the center of the board. Of course, the pawn on f4 will be defended because of your bishop from c1. So after d3, the best move for black is to play c6 now, and after bishop a4, he simply plays the move knight to e7, he will castle, and you have, if you are black, great position. You will play d5, striking into the center of the board with this pawn break. And I think, of course, black must equalize firstly, but of course after bishop b7, bishop b6, bishop c7, maybe he will strike at the center, maybe he will develop bishop to g4 after the move h5, and you might even attack on the king side, and you are completely better if your opponent doesn't know what to do. So after knight to e7, the best and the crucial move in this position is to play the move pawn to f4, and then all the counterplay is prevented because h4 is now not a thing because you are controlling too much space in the center. Of course, then the attack cannot work because you control more space than your opponent. You will play king to h1 and maybe c3 in the future. You will play bishop b3, putting pressure on the f7 pawn as well. This idea is really nice. Maybe you will even play move queen to h5, and if you're a white, now you are slightly better. Of course, the position is not lost. You can play d5 now, and after trade, you take back with the knight. After check, I don't know, knight e7. This is not the theory, this is just the logical moves. And now black is at least equal because I played kinda badly. But of course, you after d5 you can play e5 maybe. And of course, white is slightly better in these positions. But what I want to say is that black has a lot of chances if white doesn't play this move f4, controlling the space in the center of the board. So f4 in bishop c5 variations is really important, and if your opponent after you castles don't play the move bishop to c5, but he plays the move pawn to c6, then this is the main line, and after bishop c5, d3, c6, you play the move bishop a4, and after the main line, after castles, your opponent play the move c6, then you will play bishop c4, not bishop a4 as earlier. You will play bishop to c4, maybe even sacrificing the bishop in some positions. Of course, this is not good, but of course maybe you are threatening the move queen to f3, maybe even queen to h5 in some positions. And of course, if you are white, you should play bishop c4, because your bishop from a4 will go to b3 eventually on this diagonal, so bishop c4 is just okay. And of course, after knight to f6, rook 1, d6, c3, now you can see that this pawn on d4 is kinda weak, because it will have to take the c3 pawn, and after you will take back, you will have massive center. So in this main line of the bird's defense, black tries to do something on the king side. Of course, the only good move in the position is to play knight to g4. This is the theory. Of course, now you cannot take the pawn, although it seems it is free, but after queen to h4 you will be much worse, because of course not only will your opponent fork the f2, but the f2 and the h2 pawn, but you will of course lose a lot of time. You will have to play something like h3, and after queen takes f2 you will have to play this awkward looking move king to h1, and then your position is simply bad. And so you have to play the move h3, kicking away the knight, and after knight to a5, now you cannot take the pawn once again, because the knight is hanging, the bishop is hanging on c4. So after d3 the trade occurs, and after d takes c3 you can see that we take back with the knight, and we have this monster bind on d5. That means that your opponent will never ever push the pawn to d5. You will even play maybe b3 and bishop to b2, putting this bishop on this very long diagonal. But if you are black, you can play bishop e7 and castle. Maybe you will play bishop to e6, and maybe in some positions you will play d5, excuse me, you will play queen b3 and rook d8, and then you will play d5 maybe. So I think the move c6 after white castles is not as good as bishop to c5, and if you are black, I recommend you to play bishop c5 if you play the bird's defense, not the move c6. So this was the bird's defense, and after bishop to b5, today we'll look at g6 firstly, and then we'll look at knight to e7, the Cozio defense later on. So g6 here is known as the fianchetto defense, or the Smyslov defense. You will fianchetto your bishop to g7 square, and when this pawn will get straight off for d4 pawn, this bishop will have this monster looking diagonal, and of course you will have much better dark square bishop than your opponent on c1. So after the move c3, your opponent plays the move a6. This is the main line and the best move. So after bishop a4, your opponent as black will probably play d6. This is the best move, d6. Your opponent, if you are white of course, and if you are black, you should play d6, stabilizing the position. And after d4 you should play bishop to d7, of course the only move. After castles you play the move bishop g7, of course fianchettoing the bishop. You will play knight e7 and you will castle. And after rook e1, just improving the position, maybe the e-file will open up in some positions, so rook e1 is smart move. And after black plays the move knight g to e7, now this retransposes to the modern Stein's defense. The Stein's defense after bishop b5, a6 and bishop a4, d6. This is the same position as we have seen in the game. This kind of position, rook e1, knight e7, is the same position as here. After the move knight to g to e7, this is the same position, but with the move g6 on the third move of the game. So after knight g to e7, your opponent, if you are black, will most likely play the move d5, the main line, and after knight to b8, you don't trade the bishops, you keep the tension, you play the move c4, of course improving the position, stabilizing the d5 pawn, and after black castles you play the move knight to c3, and this is the main line of the modern Stein's defense. And of course you transpose to the previously covered variation. You can check out this video in my channel. And of course now this is the end of the theory. You can see that this bishop have tension, and maybe now you take the bishop, and after knight takes a4 you will play something like knight to d7, you will play c5 maybe later on, and after takes you will take back with the knight, having this d4 square, of course supported by the bishop from g7, and maybe you will play f5 if you are white, and if you are black, excuse me, if you are white you will play knight d7, f3 maybe, you will develop this bishop maybe to g4, g5, maybe you will trade off the bishops with this kind of plan. And of course, if you play the modern Stein's defense against the Ruy Lopez, you should try this g6 move. Maybe you will surprise some of your opponents that doesn't know how to retranspose back to the Stein's defense, and you will have much better position, because you can get wrong very quickly. Castles is inaccurate in this position, because after bishop to g7 now many of your opponents will just play knight to c3, which is big mistake. Of course the position is equal now, but you are threatening f5, and after d3 you will simply castle, and you have much better position. If you ask me, the computer says it is equal, but you have the fun. You will play f4, f5 in this position, you will open up the center, and you will have much better this bishop than this from c1. So of course the pawn to g6, the fianchetto or modern Stein's defense, if allowed, is very good. And of course, but today we are focusing on the main line, which is knight g to e7, the main line of the sidelines kinda. This is known as the Cozio defense, and the purpose of this move is to simply just support the c6 knight, and of course now you cannot take the knight because you will take back with the knight and everything would be fine in your position. So after knight g to e7, the best move for white and the only move that is played on the highest level is the move castles, of course. And now you have the similar idea to the fianchetto defense. You play the move g6, trying to play bishop g7, putting this bishop on this long diagonal, and after c3, this is common idea in the Ruy Lopez, especially if black plays the move g6, you want to play like this, you want to outstare this bishop from g7, and you want him to bite on granite, and you would have much better position. But of course black plays here the move bishop g7, and after d4 he takes the pawn, and now he plays the move d5, opening up the center, and after the trade occurs you take back with the knight, of course, not allowing any knight to c3 ideas. If queen takes, there is knight to c3, of course, because the bishop is pinned, of course, then you cannot take the pawn. And after e takes d5, knight takes d5, now you play the move rook to e1 check, of course, taking advantage of uncastled king in the center of the board. And after bishop e6, of course the only move in the position for black, now you simply play the move bishop g5, and after queen to d6, you can see that now black will castle short. He has activated his queen, he will have connected rooks, and you have to connect your rooks as well. And after knight b to d2, black simply castles, and after you play the move knight to e4 attacking the queen, your opponent, if you are white, will simply play the move queen to b4, and now you are kind of forced to take on c6 and to play queen to c1, of course defending the pawn and pressuring the c6 pawn as well. And after rook f to e8, of course now you cannot really take the pawn on c6. Why not? Because after something like queen to b6, or maybe even taking the pawn, you will be kind of worse, because after queen b6, if you take the queen, then you take with the a pawn, and the a file opens up. This d4 pawn is isolated pawn, and when pieces disappear off the board, then isolated pawns get very weak. And of course this position, if anyone is better, it is black. This bishop is laser beaming this long diagonal, so after queen to c1 and after rook f to e8, you shouldn't really take the c6 pawn. You should play the move bishop d2, and after queen to b6, of course, protecting the b6 pawn. Now you play knight to c5, and after bishop to f5, of course, black is not allowing to take the bishop. So after bishop f5, you simply play the move knight to e5, not allowing any trades to occur down the e file. And after rook a to d8, you simply play the move b3 if you are white. And this is kind of the end of the theory, but as you can see, I think black has amazing position. He will put his knight on b4 and maybe threaten some ideas with the move knight to d3. Black has the two bishops, and I think sidelines in the Ruy Lopez are very good for black if black knows what he is doing, if he knows the middle game's plans, he will be much better in the middle game, I think. And this is the end of the theory, as I mentioned. But of course, if you are white, you shouldn't be really afraid of any sidelines in the Ruy Lopez. You should spend some time in the opening thinking what you will do. But of course, sidelines are sidelines with the reason they are not as good as some of the main lines. And of course, if you are black, you should push for a win with the sidelines in the Ruy Lopez, because many of your opponents won't know what to do, and sidelines are a very good weapon to surprise your opponents. So if you like the video, make sure to subscribe to follow more such content, and see you guys in another video.